To narrow the U.S.'s trade deficit has backfired with record numbers. Why has he failed so far? Is he fixating on the wrong issue? And in our continuing series, Ask China, we'll look at China's national defense with Major General Xu Hui, Commandant of the International College of Defense Studies of the National Defense University. Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Despite U.S. President Donald Trump's efforts to tame the U.S.'s trade deficit, the numbers spiked last year. The deficit in goods grew 10% year-on-year to $891 billion, the highest in record, according to data released by the U.S. Department of Commerce last Wednesday. Last year's deficit in goods widened the most, with China the biggest target of President Trump's trade war by $44 billion to reach $419 billion. In addition to imposing tariffs on $250 billion worth of goods imported from China so far, President Trump's America First crusade has included pulling out of trade deals such as the NAFTA and TPP and renegotiating deals with various trading partners. Why has the U.S.'s trade deficit surged so much? Is Trump's strategy backfiring? And is a trade deficit really such a bad thing for a domestic economy? Joining me for the discussion in the Beijing studio are Gong, Professor of Economics at the University of International Business and Economics, and David Mahon, Managing Director at Mahon China Investment Management Ltd. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Let's explain a little bit the numbers, because normally when we talk about trade deficit, we're actually talking about two parts: deficit in trade in goods, or deficit or surplus in services. And just now, the $890 billion is actually only the number in terms of trade in goods. Well, I want to show you this tweet from President Trump last March, which reads, "The United States has an $800 billion yearly trade deficit because of our very stupid trade deals and policies. Our jobs and wealth are being given to other countries that have taken advantage of us for years. They laugh at what fools our leaders have been no more." So I want to ask you this question, Professor Gong first. There are two numbers, as I said, the overall trade deficit and the deficit in the trade in goods. Here, President Trump used $800 billion, which is only the number in goods, whereas actually the overall trade deficit is smaller. For instance, this year, for 2018, it was 620. Why has he chosen to use the word 800 billion?
Oh, it's obviously because he wants to make a big deal out of this, wants to persuade American people that, trade deficit. Actually, I'm very surprised he used the word trade deficit. Usually, deficit doesn't exist in his vocabulary. It's the trade loss he usually refers to. He usually describe as trade loss, right? But anyway, I think, the U.S. economy is a service-oriented economy. If you look at the GDP of America, 80% is service. So, service exports is a real strength of America. And for many, many years, still to today, the United States maintains a trade surplus in services. But of course, the trade surplus is not able to compensate for the trade deficit in goods. So overall, there's still a very sizable trade deficit. I think it's okay. But, the problem is, it's a fundamental problem is what I describe as a trade deficit in economics profession, what's called a trade deficit, because U.S. Its currency is international currency. It maintains a very large, fiscal deficit, and it's quite likely that, according to the GDP equations, quite likely to maintain also a very large trade deficit. And a couple of other reasons exacerbated this trend. For example, the strengthening of the U.S. dollar last year, the tax cuts, economy is doing very well last year in the United States. All these factors contribute to increasing demand in imports. So that's the reason, because that's the reason why we're seeing these numbers surging.
Okay, Mr. Mahon, how do you see the number growing to record highs in terms of trading in goods in particular?
It's a pretty arbitrary number. I think if you break it down he's using the highest number possible, and it's not really supported by the underlying data. But actually, China is not the cause of the American deficit issues. America's been in deficit since the late 70s. It essentially borrows more money than it can afford. It lives beyond its means, and so it borrows from the rest of the world. And on that basis, it will never resolve its trade deficit situation with one country. It's a matter of living within its means. So even if China opened its markets, particularly in services, further to allow consulting firms, engineering firms, all manner of service firms to come into China, then actually the number would grow even further because more American companies would put their money into China. So he's asking for an opening of markets on the one hand, which will actually increase the problem that he says is being created by China.
Is it going to happen that the US's surplus with China in service will go up as China opens wider to services from the United States?
Not if the companies are here. If they come to China and they come into the market in their own right, then in a sense money, individuals, specialists will be coming out to live in China. So in that sense, America will lose more to China, according to what Donald Trump defines as losing in a trade relationship.
What is, yeah, exactly. Does a bigger trade deficit means that a country actually lose in terms of dealing with another country? I mean, for instance, if I go into a shop and buy something, I never get money from the shop. I always pay into the shop, but I don't lose to the shop.
Of course not. This is totally ridiculous by saying that trade deficit amounts to some kind of a loss. The benefits of trading, the benefits, even let's talk about the trade deficit from U.S. perspective. The benefits associated with this trade deficit accrues to whom? To corporate market operating in China. A lot of trades going from China to the U.S. is associated with American companies operating here, Chinese companies participating in American companies-led global value chain, and the benefits, the profits accrued from this trade actually goes to American companies. So even if there is trade deficit from U.S. side, there's no loss for American companies. There's actually profits for American companies.
But the American consumers are probably getting the benefits trickling down, or...
Yes. I mean, that's the whole idea of outsourcing. The whole idea of American companies coming to China is precisely because of this. Companies become more competitive, goods and sold in the U.S. are becoming cost goes down, and it's also a benefit to American consumers.
Mr. Mahon, you wanted to say something?
I think something like 60% of exports to America from China are owned by American interests. And many of the components that go into the American economy manufactured here allow American companies to have cost advantages. But households have paid the same for a plastic bucket or a knife and fork, the same for about 20 years because of the low cost here. So in a sense, the American consumer has actually benefited. The problems of the American economy are to do with their own imbalances, their own dominance of monopoly companies in so many sectors.
Well, President Trump is blaming the very stupid trade deals and policies, obviously, of his predecessor, of all of the administrations that came before him. But despite what he has been trying to do to fix the U.S.'s trade deficit issue, how come the number is going the opposite direction, Mr. Mahon?
Well, you can't fix a trade deficit issue if you fight tariff wars with everybody at once, which is what he's doing. And also he's increased the cost to American companies, which has been said. The iPhone is the classic example.
I was just about to say that.
Largely produced here, leaving a very slight profit. It's at $25 out of 800. The rest, 400, goes to the supply chain in Asia. The rest is pure profit for Apple. So Apple is immensely profitable. It employs more people for marketing and for innovation and for the technology creativity that America has so much of. But it needs to have these phones produced here, or they would be unaffordable. So none of his economics makes a lot of sense, actually.
Actually, he says that he's presiding the greatest economy in the history of the United States, and he has been saying, the economy is fine, everything is fine, and there are actually numbers to support some of what he's saying. For instance, the tax cuts are giving companies more money to buy products. The job number seems to be doing fine. So exactly why there is a so-called worsening trade deficit while the economy is doing better, Professor John?
It's not in conflict. I think as the economy grows.
But President Trump sees the deficit as a bad thing, right?
That's
Although he says he has been very successful.
Right. That's, as I said, that's a very senseless, totally wrong way of interpreting trade. The first thing when you mentioned, I think, the idea that he's been residing over economy that's been the best for
the greatest
for a long time. I count this as one out of the 8,000 lies he's been making that is counted by Washington Post. It just doesn't make sense to me. But the reason that the trade deficit has been sustaining is because, as I said, the economy is doing very well in the U.S. for last year, close to 4% growth. That means demand is very good. That means that when you consume goods, the goods have to be coming from somewhere. It has to be manufactured somewhere. The United States doesn't manufacture things anymore, right? 80% is service economy. So the things have to be imported in the U.S. So as demand goes up, of course imports is going to increase. So that's not surprising. And on top of this, the dollar has been strengthening, right? So that means the more purchasing power of the dollar. And I think also another reason associated with the surging imports into the U.S., I think is precisely because of the tariff. Because last year, remember, there are a lot of orders being accelerated to trying to beat the tariff deadline. And I think, you see months after months, these numbers been doing very well. Yeah. But just February, I have to make a point. Just February, the number of Chinese exports to the United States dropped precipitously. And I think that's because people are expecting that a trade deal will be reached. They're holding back their orders. So I think that has a lot to do with the
It's very interesting because according to a report by Bloomberg, U.S.'s trade deficit has grown by more than $100 billion since President Trump took office to $620 billion. So, Mr. Mahon, do you think there is a certain element of truth that exactly President Trump's policies have contributed to the record high deficit which he tries to defeat?
I think so, and I think, as John has just noted, a lot of it is anticipating the issues of keeping stock and inventory next year, or this year, and they've done that, and now, of course, they're waiting for a result. But actually, the American economy is not doing well. When you cut taxes to the degree which he did, of course it stimulates the economy, but it drains the government of resources. And then when you borrow as much as he has been borrowing, you've got a huge financing issue. So America is likely to go into recession, I think, by next year. It's quite possible.
Well, some people are also saying that, look, maybe the deficit is high now, but we're playing a long game, right? What we're doing now, you probably experience some temporary pain, but in the long term, you're going to benefit. How do you see that kind of argument?
I think this is certainly true pertaining to the trade between the United States and China. I think at least, the current number says that the trade deficit from U.S. side is increasing last year, but I think into this year, 2019, I think we're going to see a more balanced trade, at least moving towards that direction, more balanced trade, because China is going to increase imports from U.S. and we have an agreement that we want to keep this trade deficit within certain amount of the GDP size of China. So I think this deficit situation is going to be greatly alleviated once a trade deal
in the medium term. But in the long term, I think that there is an aim underlying all this, which is to try and contain China. So whatever they're talking about in figures and imbalances, the ultimate thing is that America feels that its own shrinking as an empire is because of what China has taken from it, which is not true. In fact, it's been a great partnership between the United States and China over the last 3 decades. So as China remains getting stronger each year, and in the medium term, China will buy from elsewhere. They will become less and less dependent on the U.S.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I want to show that graphics again of President Trump's tweet, because he says our jobs and wealth are being given to other countries that have taken advantage of us for years. So basically, he sees that when a country is, selling goods to America, like China, what China has done, basically China, insinuated here, has been taking advantage of the United States for years. But I don't want to dwell on that. I want to move on and talk about the U.S.-China trade negotiations, because one of the essential points that the U.S. is asking is for China to buy more from the United States to decrease the so-called trade deficit. Is the Trump administration barking on the wrong tree there?
You know, from his perspective, when he talks about jobs, he talks about manufacturing jobs. He's only interested in manufacturing jobs, especially in the steel industry. So, so that's a misleading picture. Now, when you ask whether he's climbing back in around tree, I think, you know, I have to concede that this sustained trade deficit between China and the U.S., from that perspective, deficit, it's not sustainable. I have to admit that it's not sustainable in the long run, both economically and politically. And I think there's a reason that we need to work together to reduce certainly the amount of trade deficit. I think there are ways to address that. And from China's perspective, we can, at least I think in one area we can buy a lot of things from the U.S. That's in the energy products area.
If they sell.
Not the high-tech stuff. I'm talking about the oil and gas.
Yeah.
This is a booming industry in the U.S. The United States is going to be the largest oil-producing country in the world, and also going to be the largest oil exports country in the world.
Hopefully,
so,
yeah.
So that's going to happen.
Okay, Mr. Mahon, your viewpoint on this issue.
I think that there'll be a kind of fake truce, a truce of sorts, because Trump needs it. He's had failures. He tried to shut down the government. It didn't work. He failed in his summit with Kim Jong-un. Actually, and the numbers are beginning to look a bit shaky, and he's got an election coming in 18 months or 2 years. So he has to do something for that.
Okay.
So he'll get a fake truce.
All right. Let's keep this topic for another time. Many thanks to Gong and David Mahon. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin.